The organ music stopped mid-hymn when Walter Thompson hit the floor. 300 heads turned. The heavy thud echoed through Riverside Community Church like a gunshot on that October Sunday morning. His oversized coat fell open as he collapsed, and for the first time in 40 years, the congregation saw it clearly, the grotesque mass bulging from his right shoulder and neck, forcing his head to tilt at an unnatural angle. "Dear God," someone whispered. The children stared. The adults looked away. "The two-headed old man." A teenager muttered, just loud enough. Paramedics rushed in. The young EMT froze when he knelt beside Walter, his face draining of color at the sight of the deformity nearly the size of a grapefruit, with disturbing contours that seemed almost human. Dr. Sarah Bennett pushed through the crowd. "Let me help." Walter's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. His lips moved, barely audible. "Tell Samuel I tried." Then darkness took him. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Riverside, Indiana was the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you did. Population 200, nestled in the flat heartland where cornfields stretched to the horizon, and the biggest excitement was Friday night high school football. Main Street still had Betty's Diner with its red vinyl booths, Riverside Hardware where old men gathered to complain about the weather, and First Methodist Church where the same families had occupied the same pews since 1867. Walter Thompson's house sat on Maple Street, a small white structure with peeling paint and an overgrown garden that neighbors complained about in whispers. A single lamp burned in the window every night, had burned there for 25 years, ever since his wife Linda died. The townspeople said he left it on for ghosts. At 74, Walter was a ghost himself. Thin and stooped, he shuffled through town in an oversized coat that hung past his knees, even in the suffocating Indiana summers. The coat hid what everyone pretended not to see, the massive deformity that had grown on his right shoulder and neck since childhood, forcing his head to tilt perpetually to the left. It had started as a small bump when he was 4 years old. 70 years later, it had consumed him. The children had a rhyme. "Two-headed Thompson walks at night. If you see him, run in fright." Their parents scolded them, but never too harshly. Fear was easier than understanding. Walter had been a music teacher once, from 1907 to 2000, teaching elementary school children how to coax beauty from piano keys. 400 students had passed through his classroom. Most of them crossed the street when they saw him now. His wife Linda had died in a car accident in November 1999. The official story was black ice and bad luck. Their son Thomas, 25 years old, had died with her. Walter buried them both and stopped playing piano. His hands shook too much now anyway, though whether from age or grief, no one could say. He lived alone except for a stray cat named Sammy, 7 years old, with one torn ear and a crooked tail. Walter fed him every morning at sunrise, then sat on his porch and watched the world pretend he didn't exist. His savings account held exactly $3.42. He paid for everything with exact change, counting out pennies with trembling fingers while cashiers looked anywhere but at his face. His mother Ruth had made him promise, before she died in 98, "Never let them cut it open, Walter. Promise me." He'd kept that promise for 26 years, until the morning he collapsed in church, and the choice was no longer his to make. 3 days before he collapsed, Walter woke at 3 in the morning with pain like a knife in his chest. The mass felt different, harder, warmer. He touched it with trembling fingers in the darkness of his bedroom, and for the first time in 70 years, it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Or maybe that was just his imagination. Fear making phantoms out of flesh. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Sammy sleeping at the foot of his bed. The cat's purring was the only sound in the house, a comfort against the silence that had filled every room since Linda died. Walter looked at himself in the mirror across from his bed. The lamp from the living room cast enough light to see his reflection, a thin old man with white hair and a grotesque burden that had bent his spine over decades. He touched the mass again. "Samuel," he whispered to it, like he'd done since he was a child. "Are you angry with me?" His mother had told him when he was 15, after he came home bloody from a beating at school. "You had a twin," she'd said, her voice breaking. "Your brother Samuel. He couldn't survive outside, so God let him stay close to you." Walter had named it then, the thing growing on his shoulder, had written it letters every birthday for 60 years. The shoebox under his bed held 74 envelopes, each one addressed to Samuel in Walter's careful handwriting. He pulled out the box now and read the most recent letter, written just yesterday for their 74th birthday. "Dear Samuel, I'm Sep today. We're Sep today. I think it's time we stopped hiding." The pain in his chest intensified. Walter doubled over, gripping the edge of his dresser. When it finally passed, he made a decision that terrified him. He would ask about surgery. The next morning, he walked to Riverside Bank. Tom Stevens, the manager, was a former student from 1983. He'd been a sweet boy who struggled with rhythm, but tried so hard. Now he wore expensive suits and looked uncomfortable when Walter approached his desk. "Mr. Thompson," Tom said, forcing a smile, "what can I do for you? I need to ask about a loan." Walter's voice was quiet. It had been quiet for so long that speaking at normal volume felt like shouting. "For a medical procedure." Tom's smile faltered. He pulled up Walter's account on his computer, and Walter watched his expression change from professional courtesy to pity. "Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid you don't have any credit history, no collateral, and your current balance is $3.42, I know." Behind him, Walter heard a loan officer whisper to a colleague, "The freak wants money." Can you imagine? Walter left without another word. He walked slowly to Betty's diner, his safe place because Betty's granddaughter Emily wasn't afraid of him. The 10-year-old girl was sitting in a booth coloring when Walter entered. "Mr. Thompson." She jumped up and ran to him, holding out a piece of paper. "I drew you a picture." The drawing showed 2 stick figures side by side, both smiling. One was labeled me and the other Walter. Above them, Emily had written in careful letters, "My friend Walter." Betty appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Emily, sweetie, don't bother Mr. Thompson." "She's not bothering me," Walter said softly. He looked at Emily. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone's given me in a very long time. Thank you." He ordered coffee and a toast, $3.50. When Betty brought the check, Walter left a $5 bill on the table, every cent he had in the world. He couldn't bear to count out exact change in front of Emily, couldn't let her see how poor he was. Walking home, Walter passed Margaret Davis on the sidewalk. The 70-year-old widow had been cruel to him for 20 years, ever since her husband Robert died. She looked at him with narrowed eyes and spit near his feet. "Freak," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. But her eyes were wet. She was crying. That evening, groceries appeared on Walter's porch like they did every month. Anonymous bags of food that kept him alive. But this time, tucked between the bread and canned soup, was a note on white paper. "Forgive me for what I must do. They need to see you as I do. M.B." Walter held the note in shaking hands. M.B. Margaret's initials. He didn't understand. But the pain in his chest was getting worse, and Sunday service was in 2 days, and something told him that everything was about to change. The emergency room at Riverside Medical Center smelled of disinfectant and fear. Sarah Bennett had been back in her hometown for 18 months, long enough to recognize most faces that came through those doors. But she'd never treated Walter Thompson. He'd avoided doctors his entire adult life, keeping whatever promise his mother had extracted from him decades ago. Now he lay unconscious on a gurney, his coat finally removed, the mass fully visible under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah had seen many things in her 15 years of medical practice: burns, tumors, birth defects that made parents weep. But this stopped her breath. "Get me an X-ray," she ordered, "and call radiology. Just tell them it's urgent." 20 minutes later, she stood in the imaging room, staring at the screen, while the radiologist beside her whispered, "Oh my God." The X-ray showed something impossible. Inside the mass were structures, bone fragments, arranged like a tiny rib cage, a small formation that resembled a skull, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a rudimentary organ in the center, connected by thread-like vessels to Walter's own cardiac system. "It's not a tumor," Sarah said quietly. "It's a parasitic twin." The radiologist looked at her. "I've read about these fetus infata, but I've never seen one in an adult, and never one this developed." Sarah pulled up her medical database, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Parasitic twins were rare, occurring in approximately 1 in 500,000 births. Most were discovered and removed in infancy. But in 1950, in a small Indiana town, with limited medical technology and perhaps a doctor who was too afraid to try, a child could carry his brother for 74 years. She returned to Walter's bedside. His eyes fluttered open, confused and frightened. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said gently, "I'm Dr. Bennett. You collapsed at church. Do you remember?" He nodded weakly. "I need to explain what we found." She pulled up a chair, sat close. "The mass on your whole shoulder, it's not what you think. It's your twin brother. He was absorbed in the womb, never fully developed. But he's been part of you your entire life." Walter's eyes filled with tears. "Samuel," he whispered. "His name is Samuel." Sarah felt something crack in her professional armor. "You knew?" "My mother told me when I was 15. Said God let him stay close to me." His voice was so quiet she had to lean in to hear. I've written him letters every birthday since I was a child. The machines around them beeped steadily. Outside the room, the normal chaos of an emergency department continued, nurses calling for doctors, phones ringing, the distant wail of an ambulance. But in this room, there was only the weight of 74 years of loneliness. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said carefully, "there's a complication. Your brother's heart, what remains of it, has fused with your cardiac system. There are vessels connecting you. The mass is infected now, and the infection is spreading. Without surgery, you have perhaps 48 hours. Walter closed his eyes. "And with surgery, I'd need to bring in a specialized team from Indianapolis. The surgery would be extremely complex. The cost—" She hesitated. "I have $3.42, Walter said. "I already checked about a loan." Sarah felt her throat tighten. The surgery would cost approximately $87,000. Insurance companies don't cover what they consider pre-existing conditions that weren't disclosed. "Then I suppose Samuel and I will go together," Walter said. There was no self-pity in his voice, only acceptance. "That's probably how it should be. I've carried him this long. Seems wrong to leave him behind now." "No." The voice came from the doorway. Margaret Davis stood there, her face red from crying, her hands clutching her purse like a lifeline. Behind her, Pastor Mike Harrison hovered uncertainly. "Margaret!" Walter's confusion was evident. She walked into the room, her steps determined despite her tears. "I'm the one who's been leaving groceries on your porch for 20 years. I'm the one who wrote you that note. And I'm the one who's going to tell this whole damn town what fools we've been." She turned to Sarah. "My husband Robert died in 2004. He was burned in a factory accident. His face was destroyed. This town made his last years a living hell. They stared. They whispered. They crossed the street." Her voice broke. "When he died, only one person came to his funeral who wasn't family. Walter Thompson. He played piano at the service. He played 'What a Wonderful World' while I wept over my husband's closed casket." Walter's tears were flowing freely now. "Robert was a good man. He deserved to be honored." "So do you," Margaret said fiercely. "I've been cruel to you in public for 20 years because I thought, God help me, I thought if I was the villain, if I was so horrible to you that people were uncomfortable, maybe they'd leave you alone. Maybe they wouldn't destroy you like they destroyed Robert." She pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to Sarah. "I put my house on the market yesterday. It's worth $180,000. Use whatever you need for his surgery. The rest is for his future." "I can't accept," Walter began. "You can, and you will," Margaret said. "Robert would have wanted me to. You gave him dignity in death. Let me give you life." Eyes. News traveled through Riverside like water, through cracked earth fast, inevitable, and impossible to contain. By Monday morning, everyone knew Walter Thompson, the two-headed man they'd mocked for decades, was dying. Margaret Davis, the bitter widow they'd pitied and avoided, had sold her home to save him, and the thing on his shoulder that had made children run and adults whisper, it was his twin brother, trapped since birth, carried for 74 years. Betty's diner became ground zero for the town's reckoning. "I threw rocks at his house in night," said James Wheeler, 42 years old, staring into his coffee. "I was 17 and stupid. He never told my parents, never reported me, just swept up the broken glass and went on living." Across the booth, Claire Morrison set down her fork. Her son Jake sat beside her, the teenager who'd whispered too loud in church. "He taught me piano," Claire said quietly, 1987 through 1989. "My father lost his job and couldn't pay for lessons. Mr. Thompson taught me anyway, never asked for a penny. When I got into music school, he gave me $50, probably all he had, and told me to buy sheet music." The diner went silent. Betty wiped down the counter, her hands moving in practiced circles. "He tutored my nephew for free, got him into college. I never even thanked him." Pastor Mike Harrison arrived at 10, his usual coffee forgotten. "I'm calling a town meeting tonight, 7 o'clock. Everyone who can walk needs to be there." By 7 that evening, 150 people packed into the church basement, nearly half the town. Pastor Mike stood at the front, his face grave. "I'm going to tell you some facts," he said, "and then I'm going to ask you what kind of people we want to be." He projected images on the wall. Walter's employment record from Riverside Elementary. Perfect attendance from 1907 to 2009. 412 students taught. Volunteer work maintaining the church for 20 years. Every funeral he'd attended, every wedding, every baptism when he was invited, which wasn't often. "This man," Pastor Mike said, "has lived among us for 74 years, and we've treated him like a monster." An older woman in the back stood up. Her name was Helen, and she was 90 years old. "My grandson drowned in Miller's Pond in 2001. He was 8. Walter came to the funeral. He didn't know us, we'd never spoken to him, but he sat in the back pew and cried for a child he'd never met. When I asked him why he came, he said, 'Because no child should be mourned by too few people.' That's the kind of man you're calling a monster." The others began to stand, confessions spilling out like poison being drawn from a wound. "I wouldn't let him shop in my store," the hardware store owner admitted. "Told him to mail order. I was afraid he'd scare customers." "My daughter had nightmares about him," a mother said, her voice breaking. "I told her he was dangerous. I taught my child to fear kindness." Jake Morrison stood, his 17-year-old voice cracking. "I called him a freak yesterday in church, right before he collapsed. Maybe I killed him." "No," Pastor Mike said firmly. "But we've all participated in killing his spirit for decades. And now we have a choice. Margaret Davis sold her home to save him. What are we going to do?" The silence that followed was broken by Betty. "I'll donate $1,000, and I'll make meals for his recovery, however long it takes." "$2,000, said Tom Stevens from the bank. "And I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry." Within an hour, they'd raised $43,000. Combined with Margaret's house sale, it was more than enough for the surgery and Walter's future care. But money wasn't the only thing being offered. "I'll fix his house," the hardware store owner said. "New paint, new roof, whatever it needs. My landscaping company will restore his garden," offered another. "I'll organize a meal train," Betty added. Emily, the 10-year-old who'd drawn Walter pictures, stood on a chair so everyone could see her. "My teacher says we should love people even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Mr. Thompson isn't scary. You're all just scared of being different." The adults looked at their shoes. A child had shamed them. and rightfully so. While the town meeting raged, Sarah Bennett sat in Walter's hospital room, reading documents that had arrived by courier that afternoon. They came from Harold Thornton's attorney. Harold was 92, dying of cancer in Riverside Senior Home, and he'd finally decided to unburden his conscience. The safety deposit box key led to a treasure trove of secrets. Medical records from March 1950. Ruth Thompson's labor and delivery notes. Detailed accounts in Harold's own handwriting documenting the impossible choice he'd faced as a young doctor, attempt a separation that would almost certainly kill both twins or leave them connected, and hope for the best. He'd chosen hope and silence. But the most startling discovery was a life insurance policy, taken out in 1970 in Walter's name. The beneficiary was Walter Thompson. The monthly payments had been made faithfully for 28 years until Ruth's death in 1998. The current value, $87,000, exactly the cost of the surgery. Sarah checked Ruth's employment records. From 1950 to 1998, Ruth had worked 2 jobs: secretary at the elementary school by day and office cleaner at night, 48 years of double shifts, saving every penny she could spare. There was a letter with the policy, dated November 1998, 1 week before Ruth died. "For my son Walter," it read in shaky handwriting, "I could not give you a normal body. I could not protect you from cruelty, but I can give you a choice. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, use this to be free, or use it to live the life you want, exactly as you are. Either way, know that I loved both my sons. Samuel, who stayed with you, and Walter, who carried him. You were never broken. You were never a burden. You were always enough. Love, Mom." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at Walter, who was sleeping fitfully. She'd already run the tests. The infection was spreading faster than anticipated. They had perhaps 36 hours now, not 48. She called the surgical team in Indianapolis. Dr. Michael Foster, the best reconstructive surgeon in the state, answered on the second ring. "I'm sending you scans," Sarah said, "and I'm asking you to come to Riverside tonight, if possible." "What am I looking at?" Foster asked. "A 74-year-old man carrying his parasitic twin since birth. The twin's rudimentary heart is fused to his cardiac system. It's infected. He's dying, and I need you to save him." There was a long pause. "I've read about cases like this. I've never seen one. The surgery, Sarah, the risk is enormous." "I know, but he deserves the chance. His mother spent 48 years saving for it. His town just raised $43,000 in an hour. And if we don't try, he dies anyway." Another pause. Then, "I'll be there by midnight. Start prepping him." Sarah called Margaret next, who arrived with Pastor Mike within minutes. They needed to wake Walter and explain everything: the insurance money, the town's donations, the surgery that could save him or kill him. Walter listened quietly to it all. When Sarah finished, he looked at Margaret. "You sold your house for me." "I sold a building," Margaret corrected. "You gave my husband dignity. That's worth more than brick and mortar. And my mother," his voice broke, "she saved for me for decades. She loved you," Sarah said gently. "Both of you. She wanted you to have choices." Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need something from my house. The shoebox under my bed. Pastor Mike drove to get it. When he returned, Walter opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were 74 letters, each one addressed to Samuel in careful handwriting. "I've written to him every birthday since I was 7 years old," Walter said. "After my mother told me what he was, I wanted him to know he wasn't alone, that I knew he was there." He pulled out the most recent letter, dated just days ago. "Dear Samuel, I'm Saturday. We're 74 today. I think it's time we stopped hiding." Sarah found herself crying. Margaret was openly weeping. Even Pastor Mike had tears in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, "Dr. Foster will be here at midnight. The surgery is scheduled for 6 tomorrow morning. The risk is significant, approximately 60% chance of survival. But without surgery, you have less than 2 days. I need you to sign consent forms. I need you to understand what you're facing." Walter looked at the letters in his lap. Then he looked at Margaret. "Will you do something for me if I don't make it?" "Don't talk like that. Please? I need to know." Walter's voice was steady. "There's a patient at Greenfield Memory Care Facility, 50 miles from here. His name is Thomas Parker. I've been paying his bills anonymously through the church for 25 years. Pastor Mike's face went white. "Walter, that's where all your money went, the anonymous donor that was you. Thomas Parker isn't his real name." Walter continued, "It's Thomas Thompson. He's my son. He was in the car accident with Linda. He didn't die. He survived with severe brain injuries and amnesia. Wrong identification. The hospital thought he was someone else. By the time I was well enough to search, he was already filed under the wrong name. I found him 6 months later." Sarah's medical mind raced. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you bring him home?" "Because he doesn't remember me," Walter said. "And his pain was infinite. He has no memory of his life before the accident. I visited him every month. He's pleasant. He's kind. But he looks at me like a stranger. I couldn't—" His voice broke. "I couldn't tell him he lost his entire life, his mother, his childhood, everything. It would destroy him. So I just made sure he was cared for, that he was safe. That's what fathers do." The room was utterly silent, except for the beeping of monitors. "If I die," Walter continued, "use whatever money is left for Thomas. Make sure he's always cared for, and give him these letters. Maybe someday he'll remember, and he'll know his Uncle Samuel was with me, that he was never alone." Margaret gripped his hand. "You're not going to die. We're going to get you through this surgery. And then you're going to bring your son home." Walter smiled, sad and distant. "I've carried Samuel for 74 years. I've carried the memory of Linda and Thomas for 25. I'm tired. Margaret, maybe it's time to let them all rest." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You've spent your whole life carrying others. Now it's time to let us carry you." Dr. Michael Foster arrived at Riverside Medical Center at 11:47 p.m., accompanied by a surgical team of 6 specialists from Indianapolis. He was 53 years old, with silver hair, and hands that had performed over 3,000 reconstructive surgeries. But when Sarah showed him Walter's scans, even Foster went pale. "The fusion is more extensive than I thought," he said, studying the images. "The twins' cardiac tissue has grown into Mr. Thompson's superior vena cava. If we're not careful, we could cause catastrophic bleeding or cardiac arrest. Can you do it? Sarah asked. Foster looked at her. I can try. That's all I can promise. They met with Walter at midnight. Foster pulled a chair close to the bed and spoke with the gentle honesty that made him legendary among his patients. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be straight with you. This is the most complex case I've ever taken. Your brother Samuel has been part of your cardiovascular system for 7 decades. Removing him means separating tissues that have grown together since before you were born. The surgery will take approximately 4 hours. You could bleed out, your heart could stop, you could have a stroke, or you could die on the table and never wake up. Walter listened calmly. What are my chances? Honestly, 60-40 against you. And if you do nothing, you'll die within 36 hours. The infection is spreading to your bloodstream. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he asked something that surprised everyone. Will Samuel feel anything? Foster's professional mask slipped slightly. Mr. Thompson, Samuel never developed consciousness. He has tissue, bone fragments, rudimentary organs, but no brain, no nervous system capable of sensation. He passed away in the womb 74 years ago. But he's been with me, Walter said, through everything. My mother's death, but my wife's death, losing my son. He carried me when I couldn't carry myself. Foster leaned forward. Maybe that's true in the ways that matter. Your mother, your wife, everyone who loved you, they saw Samuel as a symbol of love, of never being alone. Maybe removing him means you're finally ready to live for yourself. Walter's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I know how to do that. Then we'll teach you, Margaret said from the corner of the room. She'd refused to leave. That's what family does. Walter looked at her. You're not my family. I am now. And so is this whole damn town, whether we deserve to be or not. Sarah placed the consent forms on the table. Mr. Thompson, I need you to sign. But I need you to understand what you're choosing. This surgery could give you years, maybe decades of life, or it could end tonight. Either way, Samuel will be gone. Walter picked up the pen. His hand shook as he signed his name. For Samuel, for me, for everyone who loved us both. At 5:30 a.m., Sarah made an unexpected decision. She called Greenfield Memory Care Facility and had them transport Thomas Parker Thomas Thompson to Riverside Medical Center. The man who arrived was 55 years old, but looked older, his face marked by the blankness of profound amnesia. He was pleasant, compliant, but his eyes held no recognition when they wheeled him into Walter's pre-op room. Why did you bring him? Walter asked Sarah, his voice catching. He won't remember. He won't understand. Because if you don't survive, he should be here, Sarah said. And if you do survive, he should be here for that too. He's your Walter, memory or no memory, that matters. Walter looked at Thomas, who smiled the empty smile of someone trying to be polite to strangers. Hi, Thomas said. Hi, son, Walter whispered. Thomas tilted his head. Do I know you? Once, a long time ago. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, confusion. Perhaps a fragment of something deeper, but it passed quickly. Sorry, I don't remember much from before. That's okay, Walter said, though his heart was breaking. I remember enough for both of us. At 6:00 a.m., they wheeled Walter into surgery. The last thing he saw was Margaret holding Thomas's hand in the hallway. Two strangers united by love for a man who'd been invisible to the world for 74 years. The anesthesiologist asked Walter to count backward from 10. 10, Walter said, thinking of his mother while counting his fingers when he was born. 9. Thinking of the piano keys he'd taught children to play. 8. Thinking of Linda's hand in his on their wedding day. 7. Thinking of Thomas as a baby, so small and perfect. 6. Thinking of Samuel, the brother who never got to grow. 5. Thinking of every cruel word, every thrown rock, every person who crossed the street. 4. Thinking of Margaret's groceries, left anonymously for 20 years. 3. Thinking of Emily's drawing my friend Walter. 2. Thinking of the letters he'd written, 74 years of love poured onto paper. 1. Thinking maybe, just maybe, he deserved to live. Darkness. The surgery began at 6:15 a.m. Foster made the first incision at 6:18, cutting carefully through layers of skin that had stretched and distorted over decades. The mass was larger than the imaging suggested, 9 inches in diameter, with tissue that felt almost organized, purposeful. "It's like unwrapping something precious," Foster murmured to his team. "Not removing a tumor. This was a person, someone who never got to be." They worked in focused silence, sutures and clamps and the steady beep of monitors. At 7:00 a.m., they reached the inner layers. The surgical team gasped collectively. Inside the mass was a perfectly formed rib cage, no bigger than a bird's. Tiny vertebrae, fragments of what could have been a spine. And at the center, a small organ roughly the size of a walnut, Samuel's rudimentary heart, still connected to Walter's cardiovascular system by 3 delicate blood vessels. "I've never seen anything like this," Foster said quietly. "He was more developed than the scans showed. He was a person? He just never got to live outside his brother." The team observed a moment of silence. Respect for the life that never was. At 7:30 a.m., they began the delicate work of separating Samuel's heart from Walter's. It required microscopic precision, each vessel carefully clamped and severed. At 7:47, Walter's blood pressure dropped suddenly. "He's crashing," the anesthesiologist called out. "Pressure's fallen, heart rate erratic." Foster worked faster, his legendary steady hands moving with desperate precision. "Still dropping, BP 60/40. The monitors began their terrible screaming. "He's in cardiac arrest, starting compressions." A nurse began CPR while Foster continued working. They had minutes, maybe seconds. "Charging defibrillator, clear." The shock made Walter's body arch off the table. Nothing. The monitor showed a flat line. Again, clear. Another shock. Still nothing. Outsit in the surgical waiting area. Margaret gripped Thomas's hand. 200 townspeople had gathered overnight, filling the hallways, spilling into the parking lot. When the code alarm sounded, the silence was absolute. Emily was there with her grandmother Betty, crying into her hands. Pastor Mike stood with his head bowed, lips moving in prayer. Jake Morrison, the teenager who'd called Walter a freak, had his face pressed against the wall, shoulders shaking, inside the OR. Foster prepared for a third shock. "This is his last chance," he said. "Clear." The electricity jolted through Walter's body. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then beep, beep, beep. The heart monitor came alive, showing a rhythm, weak but steady. "We've got him," Foster said, his voice shaking. "He's back." Walter's eyes moved beneath closed lids. In that space between death and life, he saw something, or thought he did. Linda stood in white light, smiling. Behind her was a young man of 25. With Walter's eyes and Linda's smile. "Hi, Dad," the young man said. I'm well. This is what I would have looked like." Samuel's form shimmered, not quite solid. "Thank you for carrying me for 74 years. You gave me life, but it's time now. Time to let go." Linda reached out her hand. "Live, Walter. Live for all of us. Live loud. Live free. Live big." "I'm tired," Walter said. "I've carried so much for so long." "Then let them carry you now," Samuel said. "That's what love does. It takes turns." The white light began to fade. Walter felt himself being pulled back to pain, back to the living world, back to a body that suddenly felt impossibly light. "Thank you, Samuel," he whispered, as the vision disappeared. "Thank you for staying with me." At 9:30 a.m., Dr. Foster completed the final suture. Samuel's remains had been carefully removed and placed in a sterile container with dignity. "We'll preserve these for Mr. Thompson," Foster told his team, "for burial or cremation. Whatever he chooses." He removed his surgical mask, exhausted. "I've been a surgeon for 20 years. This is the first time I've operated with tears in my eyes." Walter woke 3 days later to a world he didn't recognize. The hospital room was dim, curtains drawn against afternoon light. But even in the dimness, something felt wrong. His body felt strange, unbalanced, lighter on one side, as if part of him had been carved away. He reached for his right shoulder with his left hand. It was flat. Panic seized him. He tried to sit up, gasping, and immediately regretted it. As pain lanced through his chest, monitors began beeping frantically. "Samuel, kid," he whispered. "Where's Samuel?" Sarah rushed in, followed by a nurse. "Mr. Thompson, you need to stay calm. You're okay, but you made it through surgery." "Where is he?" Walter's voice rose, cracking. "Where's my brother?" Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, her hand on his arm. "He's at rest. Walter, the surgery was successful. You're going to live." Walter's eyes filled with tears. For 74 years, he'd carried that weight, that constant presence, that reminder that he was never alone because Samuel was always there, pressed against his shoulder, a burden that had become comfort. And now he was gone. "I feel so light," Walter said, and it sounded like a confession, like I could float away, like there's nothing anchoring me anymore. "That's called freedom." Margaret's voice came from the corner. She'd been there the entire 3 days, leaving only to shower and change clothes. "That's what living for yourself feels like." Walter turned his head and realized with a shock that he could turn it fully, without resistance, without pain. His neck moved freely for the first time since he was 4 years old. The simple motion brought fresh tears. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to be just Walter. I've always been Walter and Kimmel." "Then we'll figure it out together," Margaret said. The infection had been worse than anyone anticipated. For 2 days after surgery, Walter had battled sepsis, his fever spiking to dangerous levels. His organs had begun to fail, first his kidneys, then early signs of liver dysfunction. Daseke. Foster had been brutally honest with Margaret and Sarah. His body doesn't know how to function without the mass. For 74 years, his immune system, his cardiovascular system, his entire physiology adapted to carrying Samuel. Now that he's gone, Walter's body is in shock. On the second night, when Walter's fever hit 104 degrees, the medical team prepared Margaret for the worst. "You should call people," a nurse said gently. "Family, friends, anyone who should say goodbye." Margaret had looked at the nurse with red-rimmed eyes. "I am calling people. I'm calling this whole damn town." By midnight, over 300 people filled the hospital in waiting rooms, hallways, outside in the parking lot. They brought candles. They sang hymns. They prayed for a man most of them had spent decades ignoring. Emily and the children from Walter's old music classes made cards. Hundreds of them. "Get well, Mr. Thompson. We love you. Come back to us. Thomas Parker. Thomas Thompson." Dad sat in a wheelchair outside Walter's room. The brain-injured man who remembered nothing stared at the door with an expression nurses couldn't quite read. Not recognition, but something. On the third morning, when Walter's fever finally broke and his vital signs stabilized, the entire hospital erupted in cheers so loud that patients 3 floors away woke confused. Now, 5 days post-surgery, Walter was finally awake and lucid, but the emotional cost was written across his face. "I dreamed about him," Walter said to Sarah during her evening rounds. "Samuel, he told me it was time to let go, that he'd carried me as much as I'd carried him." "Maybe he did," Sarah said. "Maybe that mass your brother gave you a reason to keep living when you had nothing else. Your mother died. Your wife died. You thought your son died. But Samuel was still there. You couldn't give up because you were living for 2. Walter stared at the ceiling. "And now, what do I live for?" The door opened. Thomas was wheeled in by a nurse, his face pleasant, but blank as always. "Mr. Thompson has a visitor," the nurse said. Walter's heart clenched. "Thomas, you don't have to be here. I know you don't remember." "I remember something," Thomas interrupted. His voice was uncertain, confused. "I don't know what it is, but when I'm near you, I remember a sound, a rhythm, like," he struggled for words, "like a heartbeat and a metronome at the same time." Walter went very still. When Thomas was 5, Walter had taught him piano with a metronome ticking beside them. The boy used to fall asleep to that sound tick, 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 pressed against Walter's chest, feeling his father's heartbeat keeping time. "The metronome," Walter whispered. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, that word, metronome." He looked at his hands. "And my fingers know something. They want to move in patterns, like they remember something my brain doesn't." Sarah and Margaret exchanged glances. The brain was mysterious. Sometimes memories lived in the body when the mind couldn't hold them. "Would you like to try?" Walter asked carefully. "To play piano." Thomas nodded slowly. 2 nurses helped Walter into a wheelchair. They took him and Thomas to the hospital chapel, where an old upright piano sat unused in the corner. Walter positioned himself at the bench. Thomas sat beside him, exactly as he had 30 years ago, As a child, Walter placed his hands on the keys. They shook badly from surgery, from medication, from 74 years of carrying weight that had bent his spine and gnarled his fingers. But when he began to play a simple C major scale, Thomas's hands moved with him, hesitant, uncertain, but moving. "I know this," Thomas said, wonder in his voice. "I don't know how I know this, but I know this." Walter's tears fell on the white keys. "That's because I taught you a long time ago, before the accident, before everything." Thomas looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. "Are you my father?" 3 words, a question that held 30 years of loss. "Yes," Walter said. "Yes, I'm your father." Thomas's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, I don't remember. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry." Walter pulled his son close, feeling the solid weight of him. "Real here. You're here now. That's all that matters. We'll make new memories." Outside the chapel, Margaret wiped her eyes. Sarah stood beside her, equally moved. "He's going to make it," Sarah said. "They both are." But even as Walter held his son, even as hope flickered for the first time in decades, a darkness was gathering that none of them could see. The infection wasn't entirely gone. The revelations came like falling dominoes, each one striking harder than the last. It started with Harold Thornton's deathbed confession. The 92-year-old former doctor was in his final days at Riverside Senior Home, cancer consuming what little remained of him. He'd asked Pastor Mike to bring Walter to him, but Walter was still too weak to leave the hospital. So Harold came to Walter instead, transported by ambulance on a cold October morning, 9 days after the surgery. They wheeled him into Walter's room on a gurney. His face was skeletal, yellow with jaundice, but his eyes were clear and determined. Margaret and Sarah were present. Pastor Mike stood near the door like a witness to history. "Walter," Harold's voice was barely a whisper, "I need to confess before I meet my Maker. I've carried this for 74 years, and it's time you knew everything." Walter, still weak but healing, nodded slowly. Harold began to speak, and the story that emerged shattered every assumption Walter had built his life upon. March 15th, 1950. Ruth Thompson had gone into labor at Riverside Hospital. Harold was 23 years old, fresh out of medical school, only his first week as a practicing physician. The birth had been complicated breech presentation. Twins, one of them malformed. "Samuel came first," Harold said. "His breathing labored. He was stillborn, or we thought he was. His heart was beating, but so faintly. He was a parasitic twin, partially formed. His body fused to his brother's. In 1950, we had no technology to safely separate you. The hospital board made a decision." Walter's hands gripped the bed rails. "What decision?" "They told your mother only one baby survived. They were going to dispose of Samuel's body. But Ruth God, she was fierce. She woke during the procedure and saw both of you still connected. She screamed for us to stop." Harold's tears came freely now. "I told her the truth, that Samuel was gone, but his body remained attached to you, that removing him would likely kill you both. She made me promise, made the whole hospital swear that we would never tell you, that we would let you grow up believing Samuel was just a growth, a deformity, nothing more. But she told me when I was 15, Walter said. She told me he was my twin because she couldn't bear the lie any more, but she never told you everything. Harold reached into the bag beside his gurney and pulled out a worn leather journal. This was your mother's. She kept it from the day you were born until the day she died. Sarah took the journal and began reading aloud. Ruth's entries chronicled a life of sacrifice and secrets. How she'd taken a second job cleaning offices at night to save money for a surgery that might someday be possible. How she'd opened a life insurance policy in 1970, paying into it faithfully for 28 years. The policy was worth exactly $87,000. She was cleaning offices until the month she died, Walter said, his voice breaking. I thought she was just working late at the school. I never knew. She didn't want you to know, Harold said. She wanted you to have choices when the time came, to remove Samuel or to keep living as you were. Either way, she wanted it to be your choice, not made by poverty or desperation. Margaret spoke up. The insurance money, that's what paid for your surgery, not my house sale that was for your future. Your mother saved you 30 years ago. And Walter couldn't speak. His mother had worked herself to exhaustion for decades, saving every penny, all so he could someday choose freedom. And he'd never known, never thanked her. She died thinking she'd failed him. But Harold wasn't finished. There's more. About the accident, about Linda and Thomas. Sarah pulled out another set of documents from Harold's attorney, medical records from November 1999. Linda Thompson's cancer diagnosis from March of that year, 8 months before the car accident. Linda had ovarian cancer, Harold said. Stage 3. She came to me in secret, made me promise not to tell you. The treatment would have cost everything you'd saved. She chose to die rather than take the money you needed for your surgery. The room spun. Walter felt like he was drowning. No. She died in the accident. She was dying already, Sarah said gently, reading from the medical file. She had perhaps 6 months to live. The accident injured her badly, but the cancer would have taken her anyway. She spent her final months setting everything in motion, liquidating your joint savings, putting it all into your mother's insurance policy to increase the payout, making Thomas promise to take her to secret treatments so you wouldn't know. Thomas knew. Walter's voice was hollow. Your son was protecting his mother's last wish. The night of the accident, he was driving her to a chemotherapy appointment in Indianapolis. There was black ice. A semi-truck crossed the median. Thomas was thrown from the vehicle. Severe traumatic brain injury. Linda died 3 days later from internal injuries and cancer complications. Sarah continued reading. The identification confusion happened because Thomas had no ID on him. It was thrown from the car. A wallet was found near the wreckage belonging to Thomas Parker, the truck driver who died. The hospital mistakenly assumed your son was the truck driver. By the time you were conscious and asking about your family, Thomas had already been transferred to long-term care under the wrong name. I looked for him, Walter said, his voice cracking. After they told me he was dead, I looked at the body in the morgue. It wasn't him. I knew it wasn't him. But they said the fire they said identification was difficult. I thought I was going crazy, not recognizing my own son. You weren't crazy, kid, Margaret said firmly. The system failed you. The hospital failed you. Thomas Parker was the truck driver. Your Thomas was alive, 50 miles away, and no one knew. How did you find him? Walter asked Sarah. Hospital records. When I was reviewing your financial history, I noticed monthly payments to Greenfield Memory Care. I investigated and found a patient listed as Thomas Parker, but his age matched your son's. I pulled photos from the facility. He looked exactly like the picture you kept in your wallet. Walter looked at the photo Sarah handed him. Thomas at 23, smiling, full of life and memory. Then he looked toward the door where his son sat in the hallway, a 55-year-old man with fragments of memory and a gentle, confused smile. I've been paying for his care for 25 years, Walter said. Every month. It took everything I had. That's why I had $3 left. But I couldn't tell him who I was. He looked at me like a stranger. I couldn't bear to tell him he'd lost his mother, his whole life, everything. So I just made sure he was safe. Pastor Mike stepped forward. Walter, that's not the end of the story. There's something else Harold needs to tell you. Harold's breathing was labored now, his time clearly short. Linda left you a letter. She gave it to me the week before she died, made me promise to give it to you only after surgery, if you survived. Sarah opened the sealed envelope. Dated November 1999. Linda's handwriting flowed across the pages, and Sarah read aloud. My dearest Walter, if you're reading this, you made it. You let Samuel rest. You chose to live. I need you to know I knew about the cancer. I had 8 months before the accident. I chose not to treat it. I chose you. Don't be angry. I'd make the same choice every day. The money went into your surgery fund. The rest of my time went into loving you. Thomas knows. He was taking me to treatment the night of the accident. He's been protecting my secret as I protected yours. Please forgive him. He did what I asked. Walter, you've spent your whole life carrying people. Samuel, your mother, me in memory, Thomas in grief. Now let them carry you. Inside this box is my wedding ring. I couldn't wear it at the end, too swollen. Put it with Samuel's remains. They're bound together, the brother who stayed with you, the wife who chose you. Find peace. You always said Samuel was your guardian angel. Maybe he was. Maybe I am too. Maybe Thomas will be. Live, my love. Live big, live loud, Swansquan. Play piano again. Find joy. Let people love you. You deserve it. You always did. Forever yours. Linda. P.S. I never told you the day we met. I saw Samuel first. You were wearing that thin shirt. I didn't fall in love despite him. I fell in love with all of you. You are not complete without your history, without Samuel, without loss, without love. You are whole as you are, because of what you've carried. Be whole, be free, be loved. The silence that followed was absolute. Walter stared at the letter, at Linda's handwriting, at words written 25 years ago by a woman who'd loved him enough to die for him. She saved me, he whispered. My mother saved me. Linda saved me. They both died to give me life. And now you have to live for them, Margaret said. That's what they wanted. Not your death, your life. Thomas appeared in the doorway, guided by a nurse. Something in the emotional atmosphere had drawn him. He looked at his father with those confused, gentle eyes. Why is everyone crying? Thomas asked. Walter looked at his son, his living son, returned from the dead through sheer chance and medical mystery. Because we just found out how much we're loved, Walter said, and how many people fought for us to be here together. Thomas sat beside his father's bed. His hand found Walter's, the touch natural despite his amnesia. I'm glad we're together, Thomas said simply. I don't know why, but I'm glad. Harold's breathing had become shallow. He looked at Walter with dying eyes. I'm sorry for all the secrets, for waiting so long. Your mother and Linda, they trusted me with their love for you. I failed them by staying silent. No, Walter said firmly. You kept their secrets because they asked you to. You protected me in the only way you could. I forgive you. Thornton, thank you for giving me life. Thank you for helping my mother love me. Thank you for witnessing Linda's love. You didn't fail anyone. You carried your burden just like I carried mine. And Harold smiled, peaceful for the first time in decades. Thank you, he whispered. He died 3 hours later, finally freed from 74 years of guilt. November came to Riverside with frost on the windows and hope in the air. Walter was discharged from the hospital on October 30th, 2 weeks after his surgery. He didn't return to his lonely house on Maple Street. Instead, Margaret insisted he come home with her, a firm, non-negotiable demand that Walter was too weak to resist. Thomas came too. The memory care facility had no reason to keep him now that his true identity was known, and his father was alive to care for him. For the first time in 25 years, father and son lived under the same roof. Margaret's house was a modest 2-story colonial with yellow siding and a wraparound porch. She'd lived there alone since Robert's death in 2004, and the house had grown quiet with loneliness. Now it burst with life, 3 broken people learning to heal together. The first morning, Walter woke disoriented. His right side felt strange, unbalanced. For 74 years, he'd compensated for the weight on his shoulder, leaning left, adjusting his posture, learning to sleep on one side. Now, his body didn't know how to lie flat. He came downstairs to find Margaret cooking breakfast, the first time she'd bothered in years, and Thomas setting the table with careful precision. His damaged brain remembering patterns, even when it couldn't remember people. I don't know why I know to put the fork on the left, Thomas said, staring at the silverware, but I know it goes there. Your mother taught you that, Walter said softly. Linda believed in proper table manners. Thomas smiled his gentle, confused smile. She sounds nice. She was the best person I ever knew. They ate together scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, simple food made extraordinary by the presence of company. Sammy the cat, retrieved from Walter's house by Pastor Mike, wound between their legs under the table. This is what a family breakfast looks like, Margaret said, and her voice caught. I'd forgotten. The town had finished renovating Walter's house while he was in the hospital. New blue paint, Linda's favorite color. The garden restored with late-season mums and ornamental kale. The roof patched, the porch reinforced, the interior scrubbed clean. But the most remarkable change was in the living room, where Walter's old upright piano had sat battered, out of tune. Silent for 20 years, there now stood a beautiful baby grand, its black surface gleaming. A card was attached. For the music teacher who taught us all, Riverside. 300 people had pooled money for it, even those who'd mocked him, even those who'd thrown rocks at his house, even those who'd taught their children to fear him. They'd all contributed. Walter stood in his living room, staring at the piano, and wept. Thomas stood beside him, one hand reaching out to touch the keys. His fingers trembled, then pressed down. Middle C, then D, then E, a scale. Hesitant and imperfect, but a scale nonetheless. "I remember this," Thomas said, wonder in his voice. "I remember sitting beside someone, bigger hands over mine, a voice saying, 'One finger at a time, homie, no rushing.'" Walter's breath caught. "That was me? I called you Tommy." Thomas looked at him, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes, not full memory, but recognition. "Dad, one word, but it was everything." By mid-November, Walter had started teaching again. Word spread quickly. Free piano lessons at the community center, Saturday mornings. All ages welcome. The first week, 12 students showed up. The second week, 30. By the third week, they had to split into multiple sessions. Walter's hands still shook from surgery and age, but his students didn't care. They were there to learn from the man who'd survived the impossible, who'd carried his brother for 74 years and lived to tell about it. Emily was his star pupil, her small fingers dancing across the keys with natural talent. But Walter's greatest joy was teaching alongside Thomas. His son couldn't remember how to play, but his body remembered. Muscle memory survived what conscious memory could not. Together, father and son would demonstrate pieces, Walter's shaking hands steadied by Thomas's presence. The students didn't see two damaged men. They saw a family rebuilt, teaching through love. Margaret attended every lesson, sitting in the back with her knitting, watching with fierce prakot. She'd become the grandmother of Riverside, feeding students cookies, correcting their posture, telling them stories about the old days when the town was better, or at least when she'd allowed herself to see the good in it. Pastor Mike suggested a Christmas concert. "Give the town a chance to celebrate you," he said, "to show you they've changed." Walter was hesitant. The idea of performing, of being visible, of standing on a stage where everyone could see him, it terrified him. For 74 years, he'd tried to be invisible. But Thomas said, "I think we should do it, Dad. I think Mom would want us to." So they agreed. December 23rd, Riverside Community Church, all proceeds to the Brain Injury Association of Indiana. Thomas's choice. The preparation consumed the town. Betty's Diner became headquarters for ticket sales and decoration planning. The hardware store donated lumber for a stage extension. The high school art department created posters. Children practiced their pieces with determined focus. And slowly, steadily, Walter learned to live without Samuel. The phantom sensations persisted. He'd wake in the night feeling weight on his shoulder that wasn't there. He'd turn his head and be surprised by the freedom of movement. He'd reach to touch Samuel and find only flat skin and surgical scars. Sarah Bennett explained it during a follow-up appointment. Phantom limb syndrome. Your brain spent 74 years accounting for that mass. It built neural pathways around Samuel's presence. Those pathways don't disappear overnight. "Will I ever stop feeling him?" Walter asked. "Maybe not entirely, but you'll learn to feel other things more strongly. Joy, connection, peace. They'll become louder than the phantom." She was right. As November turned to December, the phantom sensations grew quieter. And in their place, Walter discovered feelings he'd forgotten existed. Laughter. When Thomas made a joke he didn't understand but found funny anyway. Warmth. When Margaret scolded him for not eating enough, her harsh words concealing desperate care. Belonging. When students called him Mr. Thompson, with respect instead of whispers. Pride. When Emily performed a perfect Beethoven minuet. Love. When Thomas said good night and it added, "I'm glad you're my dad. Even if I don't remember everything, I feel it. That counts." Right. That counts. Walter assured him. That counts more than memory. On December 15th, a week before the concert, Walter and Thomas visited the cemetery. 3 graves in a row. Ruth Thompson, Samuel Thompson, and a memorial stone for Linda Thompson. Samuel's grave was new, the earth still dark and fresh. His headstone read, Samuel Thompson, March 15, 1950. October stipulated, beloved son, brother, guardian angel. Walter placed roses on all 3 graves, white for his mother, red for Linda, and for Samuel. A single pink rose, the color of new life. "Hey, buddy," Walter said to Samuel's grave, "I brought Thomas. He doesn't remember you, but I've told him about you, about how you stayed with me when everyone else left, how you gave me a reason to keep living." Thomas knelt beside his father. "Po, hi, Uncle Samuel. Thank you for taking care of my dad. I've got him now. I'll do my best." Margaret stood back, giving them privacy. But Walter called her forward. "Your family, Margaret. You belong here, too." And she knelt beside them, placed her bond on Samuel's headstone, and hello to Robert. She said to the cemetery beyond, "You'd like these men. They're kind, like you were. They know what it's like to carry burdens others can't see." They sat on the bench the town had installed, a memorial bench with a plaque reading, "The Thompson Family, Love that Transcends." "Are you happy, Dad?" Thomas asked suddenly. Walter considered the question. For 74 years, happiness had seemed like something other people experienced, something he wasn't allowed to feel. Happiness was for people whose bodies worked correctly, whose lives weren't defined by loss and deformity and isolation, but sitting there with his son and Margaret, the winter sun weak but warm on his face, his shoulder light and free, piano music waiting in his fingers. "Yes," Walter said, "yes, I'm happy." December 23rd arrived with fresh snow and nervous excitement. Riverside Community Church was packed. 300 seats sold out within hours. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, crowded into the vestibule. The local newspaper sent a reporter. The Indianapolis news station sent a camera crew. Walter stood backstage, his hands shaking worse than usual. Stage fright combined with age and surgical trauma. He couldn't do this. He couldn't perform in front of hundreds of people who'd spent decades treating him like a monster. "I can't," he told Margaret, his breathing rapid. "I can't go out there." She took his hands in hers. "Yes, you can. Because this isn't about performing. It's about showing them that love wins, that kindness matters, that it's never too late to change." Thomas appeared, dressed in a suit someone had donated. "Dad, the kids are asking for you." "Emily's scared. She needs her teacher." Walter took a deep breath. Emily needed him. His students needed him. This wasn't about him at all. It was about showing traumatized children and damaged adults that a broken people could still make beautiful things. He walked onto the stage. The audience fell silent. The last time many of them had seen Walter, he'd collapsed in this very church. the grotesque mass visible for all to witness. Now he stood straight for the first time in 70 years. His right shoulder was flat, scarred but healing. His head sat level on his neck. He looked, for the first time in his life, ordinary. And that ordinariness was the most extraordinary transformation of all. "Thank you for coming," Walter said, his voice soft but carrying. "A year ago, I stood in this church and fell. I was dying, body and spirit. Tonight, I stand here alive. Not because of medicine, though that helped, not because of my own strength, because I had none left. I'm here because of love, my mother's love, my wife Linda's love, my brother Samuel's love, even though he never got to live outside of me. This community's love, even when you didn't know how to show it." He gestured to the piano. "Music isn't about perfection. It's about expression. I spent 70 years hiding. I'm done with that. Tonight, we're going to be imperfect together, and we're going to make something beautiful anyway." The concert began. Children performed with shaking hands and missed notes. Adults played simple pieces with tears streaming down their faces. Jake Morrison, the teenager who'd called Walter a freak, played a halting version of Amazing Grace and apologized through the music. The finale was Walter and Thomas together, playing You'll Never Walk Alone. And Walter's part was simple, his shaking hands limiting complexity. Thomas filled in the gaps, his damaged brain somehow remembering every note his conscious mind had forgotten. Halfway through, Walter's voice cracked as he sang. Thomas continued. Then the audience joined at 300 voices, lifting the roof, filling the church with sound so powerful it seemed to shake the foundations. Walter looked toward the ceiling and whispered, "Linda, Samuel, do you hear this? This is what you gave me. This is what love sounds like." The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes, but what Walter would remember most was afterward. When Emily hugged him and said, "You're the bravest person I know, Mr. Thompson." "Why?" Walter asked. "Because you let people see you," Emily said simply. "Even when you were scared, that's what brave means." New Year's Eve, Walter wrote in his journal the first entry of his new life, resolutions: play piano every day, not from obligation but joy. Let people help me saying yes is not weakness. Tell Thomas I love him daily. Visit Samuel's grave weekly. Stop apologizing for taking up space. Live loud. For 74 years, Walter Thompson believed he wasn't allowed to be happy. He carried his brother Samuel, carried the weight of loss, carried the shame of being different. He spent decades making himself invisible, convinced that people like him, damaged, broken, burden-bearers, didn't deserve joy. But here's what Walter finally learned, and what perhaps we all need to remember: happiness isn't something we earn through perfection. It's something we claim through courage. Walter's transformation didn't come from removing Samuel. It came from finally letting people see him, scars and all. From accepting help after a lifetime of refusing it. From understanding that the weight we carry, grief, loss, invisible burdens, doesn't disqualify us from love. It makes us human. His story asks us something profound. What are you carrying that you think makes you unworthy of happiness? What burden have you shouldered so long that you've forgotten how to put it down? Walter discovered that living loud after decades of silence is terrifying and liberating in equal measure. He learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's a bitter widow who leaves groceries on your porch for 20 years. That it's never too late for second chances, new beginnings, and the fierce, redemptive power of a community that finally chooses to see you. What burden are you ready to set down? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? And what helped you feel seen again? Share your story in the comments below.